Trillions in economic activity, millions of jobs on both sides of the border. If the provinces and states surrounding the Great Lakes were a country, that country would be one of the biggest economies on the planet. With us now for more from this year's Great Lakes Economic Forum taking place in Chicago, Illinois, we welcome Heather Mulligan. She's President and Chief Executive Officer of the Business Council of New York. And Mark Fisher is here. He's President and CEO of the Council of the Great Lakes Region. We are partnered with them all this year as part of our efforts to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the United States and Canada. And Mark and Heather, it's great to have you on TVO tonight. Mark, maybe you can just start us off by telling everybody why the Great Lakes are so important and so valuable to Canada. Let's start there.
Thanks for having me, Steve, and for covering the Great Lakes Economic Forum this year. We're really pleased to be hosting the forum in Chicago after 2 years of the pandemic and getting back into in-person events. This region to the United States and Canada is a critically important region. As you mentioned off the top, if you were to put the 8 states together, New York to Minnesota, as well as the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec, the regional economy is worth roughly $6 trillion. So that would make this region the 3rd largest economy in the world, behind giants like the United States and China, and ahead of economies like Japan and the UK and Germany. It's a region that supports roughly 50 million jobs, or 1/3 of the combined Canadian and American workforce. And, we also have roughly, I'd say more than 50% of the total trade value that goes across the border every year is a direct result of doing business in the Great Lakes region. So hugely important economic region to both countries. When we think about it in the Canadian context, and just Ontario alone, 1 in 3 Canadians live in the Great Lakes Basin, predominantly, obviously, Ontario. 40% of Canada's economic activity is derived from doing business, in Ontario, in this region. And just to put some further importance on this, 30% of Ontario's GDP is directly derived from doing business across the borders with the 8 Great Lakes states, and a little bit beyond with some of the other states in the United States of America. So it's an incredibly important economy for both countries, particularly Canada and particularly Ontario.
Heather, I guess when you're asked, or when skeptical people say to you, what's the big deal with the Great Lakes? What do you tell them?
Well, first, I tell them that it's an incredibly important component of the U.S. economy, and that the regional and cross-border trade supports hundreds of thousands of jobs, and keeps this a viable place for people to live affordably and in a beautiful climate. And employers have access to a really fantastic, robust workforce, first-class higher education. And so altogether, it makes the region extremely important to the U.S. economy.
Heather, you just said beautiful climate, and I know you've been to Buffalo in the wintertime, so how can you say that, really?
I love the snow. I grew up in Syracuse. But relatively speaking, this part of the country actually, save a few weeks, maybe months of winter. During the summer, it's wonderful. During the fall, it's wonderful. During the spring, it's actually very livable and affordable. We don't have forest fires or a lot of earthquakes or anything like that. It's really, in the world, a very, very nice place.
I get you. I was being a little facetious there, but
yeah.
So I have frozen my hiney off far too many times in Buffalo's football stadium to watch the Bills, so that's another story for another day. Tell me this, though. Heather, I got a feeling that if you stopped the first 100 people on the streets of either, anywhere New York or anywhere Ontario, despite the fact that we've had an agreement in place for half a century, they may not appreciate, and this goes for political leaders as well, they may not appreciate the significance of the Great Lakes to our collective, never mind economic activity, but just our mental health and outdoors and all of that. Why do you think that is the case?
Yeah, I think this whole region of the country maybe needs a good therapist, so we don't always appreciate what's around us. But really, I mean, the jobs that are created and supported by the economy in this part of the country really support the rest of the country as well. But it's as I mentioned, it's a great place to live and to work, very affordable, high quality education, excellent higher education, great place to start a business if you're looking for a skilled workforce. So, I mean, all around, it really is a wonderful place.
Mark, I'm going to give you sort of the conventional wisdom of of much of the last half century, and then you're going to tell me where I'm running afoul here, okay? Here's the conventional wisdom, that Canadians tend to do better, economically speaking, when there's a Republican in the White House, because, at least before Donald Trump, Republicans were not protectionist. They believed in freer trade, and that usually meant that Canada did well economically speaking. Democrats tended to be more protectionist, and therefore we did less well when Democrats were in the White House. Okay, that calculus changed under Donald Trump. How are things going so far under Joe Biden?
Well, I think to your point, I think the assumption is that Democrats are more favorable to Canada generally, but that's certainly not the case that we're seeing in the last couple of years, whether it's presidency under Donald Trump, but I would see even under President Biden. There's certainly a lot of tension. There's still a lot of friction on a number of issues, whether it's Buy America, Buy American, energy issues, food issues. Even if we have a new trade agreement, the USMCA or CUSMA in Canada, there's still a lot of friction and tension in the relationship, even under a Democratic president that is certainly supportive of Canada and that relationship. And that has been worsening, I think, over the last decade. And there are some real issues that we have to navigate. We had a great opening keynote from a former U.S. Ambassador Bruce Heyman this morning. And I think it's fair to say from my perspective that in many ways the relationship feels like we're drifting further apart and not coming together on a range of different economic issues. When we look at the rest of the world, we need to be figuring out how we can compete and win together in that global economy. So I think under both Republican and Democratic presidents over the last decade, we've certainly seen too much friction that we need to resolve and start working more closely together on a range of issues, particularly in the Great Lakes region, which again is North America's economic engine. And so when this region doesn't work for both countries, that's a real problem. And we're starting to see a lot of tension and friction in this region, whether it's EVs and the auto sector. How do we do more trade along the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is a system we built 50 years ago? There's just a lot of work we need to be doing to reset this relationship for the next 50 years. Okay,
Heather, I guess in the interest of equal time, I should ask you the same question, which is, do Americans feel they do better when there's a Liberal government in power in Canada or a Conservative government in power in Canada?
I don't know the answer to that question at all, but I can tell you this. I think there's been a lot of missed opportunities, particularly of late, in trying to sort of leverage the relationship between the two countries. For example, we could have avoided some of the problems that we're having with gas pricing if we had had more discussion with Canada up front about that. I also think semiconductor industry is a logical area where we could have a stronger partnership and accessing some of the materials, the rare earth materials that are available in Canada, rather than going to overseas countries that maybe aren't as politically friendly to the U.S.
Let me ask you, one of the irritants, obviously, since COVID has been the relative thickness or thinness of the border. And I guess I want to know, for starters, Heather, in your judgment, is the border still too thick? Is it thin enough for your liking? Talk to us about that.
I mean, in my judgment, it would be great if the border was completely open. There is so much cross-border trade between New York and Canada, and I think New York exports $17 billion worth of goods and services to Canada annually. That number could be higher if we had basically an invisible border.
Okay, when you say invisible border to Canadians, there are some red flags that go up because, of course, you're talking about from a business point of view, and Canadians
Exactly.
get very concerned about losing cultural sovereignty and that kind of thing. So I will put that to Mark. Mark, in terms of the thickness or thinness of the border, either economically, culturally, in terms of sovereignty, whatever, how are we doing on that front?
Well, I think there's been two big events that we've had to deal with as it relates to the border. Obviously, the big one was 9/11. We saw an immediate thickening of the border around that time, and it took years and years and years to remove some of that thickness at the border. Pandemic and those public health measures obviously has really brought back some of the thickness that we've chipped away at over the last number of years. And so there are some real issues there in terms of how we're moving people and goods across the border. And as Heather said, that the fluidity of that border and being able to move is just so crucial. So one of the presentations we had this morning at the forum was on globalization. And when you look at this Great Lakes region as a whole and using a factor of one, in terms of the business that this region does together for the rest of the world, they do 40 times more trade, between the 8 states and the 2 provinces than with the rest of the world. So when that border is not working, it's really hurting this region in a big way, and then ultimately having a significant impact on the success and competitiveness of both Canada and the United States. So there are still some legacy issues that remain at the border, and we need to find a way of coming up with a new vision, a strategy for the border that is making the flow of people and goods secure, but also as free-flowing as possible.
Heather, when you make that argument to political leaders in New York State that we need the border thinner for all of the reasons you just described, what kind of pushback do you get?
Well, I think that it's interesting because the political leaders in the state, frankly, a lot of times are looking at what's going on in the state and not thinking about the relationship with our other states or our neighbors in Canada, and getting them to focus on issues like ease of access to move goods across the border is not necessarily always on their radar. I would actually, with a little asterisk there, say that our current governor, Kathy Hochul, is from Buffalo, and she's very well aware of the importance of the relationship on the other side of the border. So hopeful that when she, we expect that she will likely be governor in January, and she'll have her official first term, that this is something that will be squarely on her radar.
You say official first term because, of course, she took over after Andrew Cuomo resigned, so she's in the midst of, I guess, finishing off his term before getting elected to one of her own. But, Mark, pick up the story there, if you would. Fort Erie and Buffalo, Niagara Falls, New York, Niagara Falls, Ontario. I mean, we've got a lot of border towns that rely on one another. How have they handled the pandemic over the last couple of years?
Pandemic has been really tough. I think for a lot of those border towns where they haven't seen that back and forth of families and travel for travel or for business, for leisure, it's been really, really tough. And obviously businesses have been impacted because more or less, I think goods have moved across the border, and those essential goods have moved across the border. But they certainly have been impacted in a big way. And so I think increasingly, mayors on the border region, mayors in the Great Lakes region writ large, I think really do understand the importance of this region and are starting to talk about the regional economy even more. And the importance of the Great Lakes Economic Forum is that we're trying to get state governors in those conversations as well, state and provincial legislators, federal legislators as well within Congress. So they understand the relationship much better in this region. And more importantly, where do we go for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years in terms of that economic partnership? Because as Heather said, there just isn't that level of understanding and that knowledge in terms of what is the state of play today, but what more we could be doing together to make this relationship, this region, even more successful and sustainable.
Heather, let me do one more question to you on the issue of border towns, because I suspect there are people watching or listening to us right now who think that there is terrific competition, say, between the two Niagara Fallses or between Buffalo and Fort Erie. Where are you going to buy your gas? Where are you going to get your groceries? Where are you going to leave on a flight? All of that kind of stuff. Competition between border towns, is that the way we should be looking at this issue?
Probably not. I think that there's a line that is the border, but essentially the economies on either side are very similar, and so sometimes good comes from competition. But I think generally speaking, they should be viewed as more cohesive communities, and that is something that will help sort of drive better policy.
Gotcha. Okay, you two are both at this Great Lakes Economic Forum conference in Chicago right now. And, Mark, again, for an audience that is not specialized in this issue, give us some of the takeaways you hope to get out of this conference.
Well, I think the big takeaway is that globalization today is not what it's been over the last 10, 20 years. And I think there's a recognition that there's a lot more that we as a region can be doing together. There's a lot more that we could be doing in North America, so between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, to really have a reset of an economic vision and strategy in terms of how we're going to succeed together. We share so many sectors and industries and supply chains. We have workforce moving back and forth across the border. We do innovation together. We need to be sharing more energy ideas together in terms of that clean energy transition. So the forum is really a place to have these critical conversations, to create that understanding and those relationships. And hopefully, coming out of the forum, really those visions and strategies and actions that we need to be undertaking together to really elevate the economic relationship in this region. So it's part education, it's part relationship building, and it's part, sort of how do we take action together, recognizing that the federal government has to be there, states and provinces and mayors have to be there, businesses leaders have to be there, as well as many others to tackle some of these big challenges, but also opportunities that we're facing.
Heather, I'm going to ask this question delicately, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and I'm sure you've heard it before. I'm not sure there's been a time in my lifetime when more Canadians look south of the border and scratch their head wondering what in the hell is going on in your country right now. And I don't just mean Donald Trump or Joe Biden, depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on. They see a Supreme Court decision that changed things the way they have gone for the last 50 years. They see a country where there are more guns than people. I mean, there's a lot of things about the States right now that just a lot of Canadians find very concerning. In which case, how do you want to make the case that our countries really need to be closer together in many ways, when right now, I know we're looking at you much more suspiciously than we ever have?
Yeah, I mean, I could hardly blame anyone for scratching their heads right now. I think a lot of us in the States are scratching our own heads as well. And it just shows that we have to do something about political polarization and the sort of back and forth of some really extreme politics. That is going to be a long project. And, I think that I wouldn't blame anyone for wondering what the heck is going on. All of that being said, if we can take a regional approach to solving economic issues, I think that would go a long way to showing that we can work together on other more difficult political issues.
Mark, I'll put the same question to you. I mean, how would you make the case to a Canadian audience that, given everything that's been going on in the United States for the past 5 or 6 years, that this is a place that we ought to get either economically or culturally closer to?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we are so intertwined on a number of different levels economically, and we've built that relationship over time. It certainly can get deeper, in a number of different sectors. We talk a lot about the auto sector. That's a traditional area where we've got those strong connections. But, aviation, space technology, agriculture, agri-food, life sciences and healthcare. There's a lot more we could be doing to create economic success and growth in this region. But we also have to admit that when we're trying to build those economic connections that will support both sides of the border, there are a lot of people in this region, I think more broadly in North America, who unfortunately feel left out and left behind by this fast-paced, sort of new and emerging economy. And we need to really be, upfront and honest about the fact that, from an economic mobility standpoint, from an equity standpoint, we need to address those underlying issues because there is tension, there is frustration, there is people who are feeling left out, and it's creating a bit of that anger, which when you add social media into that conversation, it just makes it extremely difficult to deal with. So if we deepen the relationship, if we get the economics right, and we start really trying to understand the fact that there are lots of people who are being left out in this shifting economy, I think it can be a really productive relationship for the longer term. But we have to really address these really stark issues, up front, and to be able to do that together on both sides of the border, which is why, again, the forum is so important for us.
Okay, Heather, in which case, give us, say, one policy change you'd like to see happen that you think would improve the economic relationship among the Great Lakes states and provinces.
All right, I'll give you my favorite one because I'm a very, very big Buffalo Bills fan. But I think having the states collaborate in the region, get together and figure out how to really make a plan for high-speed rail connecting Toronto, Montreal, Detroit, Chicago, Albany, upstate New York to downstate New York. I think that it could be transformative. It's sort of a fantasy. I know it would require a lot of political cooperation and agreement that this is a good idea. But I think we've seen how transformative having advanced transportation can be. And I think this is something that could really transform the region.
Do you think our governments are capable of that kind of collaboration in order to make that, it's a wonderful idea, but it would be a hugely ambitious project, come to fruition?
I mean, I think that they have to at least start considering it. It's not going to happen on its own, certainly, and but we need to start putting things like this on the table. What can we do as a region? I think addressing climate change is another thing that is better as a regional approach rather than each individual state or provincial government.
Now, when you talked about exports from New York State to, let's say, the province of Ontario earlier, were you including the Buffalo Bills on that list? Because I know there are a lot of people who'd be happy to have the Bills come up here.
No way, man. No way.
Just checking. Okay, just checking. Mark, we're down to our last minute here, and I just wanted to ask you, what's perhaps the least known factoid, for lack of a better word, about the Great Lakes region that you think people should know?
Oh, that's a tough question, Steve. I would say that 25% of all trade between the United States and Canada goes across one bridge, and that's the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario. That's 1/4 of all trade between both countries. So that is a vital corridor, and that's obviously why so many people were concerned in the business community when the Ambassador Bridge was shut down, but also why the Gordie Howe Bridge, which is being constructed now, is so important. So I think that's one factoid that a lot of people overlook, is just the sheer size of the economic relationship, but the amount of trade that just goes across one bridge between both countries and Michigan and Ontario.
That may explain why the trucker convoy, got cleared so quickly by the Ambassador Bridge in a way that did not take place in downtown Ottawa. But again, that's another story for another day. Heather Mulligan and Mark Fisher, we're really glad both of you could spend some time with us on TVO tonight. Enjoy the conference, and we'll be in touch as it continues.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.